Hi guys, so I decided to actually do up an example for you. So for this example, I'm actually going to do 4 events, but I'm going to make it pretty easy. I'm going to have flipping 4 coins. Okay, so coin 1, that's pretty straightforward. I can have heads or I can have tails. Notice that for these first ones, I split them out a fair bit, because as I go further and further along, these options will get closer and closer. So after my first roll of getting heads, I could then end up with heads and heads, or after my second roll, I could have a heads and a tails. If my first roll was tails, I could end up with tails, heads, or tails, tails. So there are 4 outcomes possible after 2 rolls. After 3 rolls, if I got heads, heads, I could end up with heads, 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 or heads, heads, tails. If I'd got tails, heads, I could get heads, tails, heads, or heads, tails, tails. If I'd gone tails, heads, I could go tails, heads, heads, or I could go tails, heads, tails. And after getting 2 tails, I could go tails, tails, heads, or tails, tails, tails. And then of course, for my 4th roll, I could end up freakishly getting 4 heads, or I could get heads, 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 tails. I could get heads, heads, tails, heads, or heads, heads, tails, tails. Heads, tails, heads, 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 tails, heads, tails. All right, so there's those 2. My next 2 would be heads, tails, tails, heads, heads, tails, tails, tails. Tails, heads, 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 or tails, heads, heads, tails. Yep, this takes a while. Tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, tails. Almost there. Tails, tails, heads, heads, tails, tails, heads, tails. Tails, 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 heads, or tails, 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 tails. Alright, note here guys, there are a lot of outcomes. If we count them up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 outcomes are possible.